Today is February 16, 2007, and we're at the Mooresville Library. We're here to talk with Mr. Whitey Meadows about his career for baseball and also his barbershop. But before we get into that, Mr. Meadows, we'd like to know a little bit about your remembrances of what it was like in Mooresville when you were growing up. So if you could just start there, then we'll move on from that.
Well, first of all, we moved here when I was 5 years old off of the Catawba River. The great flood of 40 ran us off the Catawba River, and we moved to a little farm outside of town, and I really got interested in baseball probably when I was about 11 or 12 years old. As far as the baseball is concerned, about 11 or 12. We didn't have the little leagues in those days, from T-ballers, from whatever on up. We started about 11 or 12 years old, and from that I used to come within a block of this where we're making this little deal here, this video, and played what was called the community house, and we would play there several times a week. I think the mill run the community house. They had a lot of other activities going on there, and it was I would come out of the country. It wasn't too many country boys that would come to town. Mostly the town boys and the Mill Hill boys were the ones that played there, but I befriended many Mooresville youngsters early on in my life, although I was living out in the country and going to a Rowan County school. But over the years, this was our base for recreation, to come and play and shop, whatever, and that was done on Saturdays. And it was later on I got interested by playing baseball. Our dad used to take us to the Moors games down here, the Mooresville Moors, and that was like the big leagues to youngsters in those days. We didn't have television. We didn't have places to see. Once in a while, barnstormers would come through and play at Charlotte. These major leaguers would come through, and we would hear of them. But we didn't even take a paper out in the countryside where I grew up, and we couldn't keep up. But we kept up with the Mooresville Moors, and these Mooresville Moors were the big leaguers to us. We could see them on the streets once in a while. I remember seeing Whitey Wilhelm walk down the street. Whitey Wilhelm is the only one that played with Mooresville that is now in the Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown. And I can remember Hoyt. In fact, the last professional game I ever played, I played with his brother Cooper. And he was equally as good as Hoyt, but he just never did get the breaks, or he never would stay. But at any rate, we had the old Moore team, and we would stand. It used to be a place down behind the fence that there was an old watchman down there. I've forgotten his name, but he would let youngsters in after about the 5th or 6th inning. Pardon me. And we could sit, they call it the crow's nest, down in the left field. We would sit on bleachers right down by the clubhouse. We couldn't roam through the stands because we didn't pay, but he'd let us in up probably about the 5th inning, sometimes earlier. And we could sit down there. Other times we would climb trees to watch ball games down there and look through knotholes. You know, this was when we had a wooden fence, and you heard of the knothole game. We would literally look through knotholes and even stand on cars. My brother parked their old cars outside, and we would stand on those cars to watch the baseball game. And that was the biggest thing going on in this town at the time, was the baseball games. And I got so interested in wanting to play with the Moors. That was my big league. I didn't really know what Babe Ruth. The only Babe Ruth I knew was a Baby Ruth candy bar, and that was the only Babe Ruth that I knew. But we got real interested. I got real interested in wanting to play, and kept polishing my skills, you might say. And they had American Legion baseball here in they had had it in the 40s, but it never would go. American Legion baseball never would go back in the 40s. And we'd lose money. Well, now we had American Legion, and I had played right over here at the community house with the greatest coach I ever played with, a fellow by the name of Fred Holt. Many people talk about Fred Holt. Many people love Fred Holt. But Fred taught me the finer points of baseball and how to get along in life. But he would come out and get us, and he came out and asked me if we would come and play American Legion baseball for Morville. Now, this was in 1951, and it started back up. I was 15 years old, and we came and we won the district that year. After many years, that back in the 40s they didn't play, but we won the district. And then in 52, which was my last year, we played again. American Legion baseball was disbanded. And then at one time, though in 51, we drew more fans to watch us than the old Morville Moors did. But in 52 was our last year, and we didn't have American Legion baseball again. In 1953, Morville, it was the last year that they had a professional team here, and so we went without professional baseball in this town for many years, and I think in 1972 was the first year. 1971, I had a group of kids in town. 15-year-olds were the oldest that we had for children that could play baseball here. 15 years old was the oldest leagues that we had in a recreation in Morville. So in 50, well, this was in the early 70s, and in 72, well, when I started toward American Legion baseball, I had 10 youngsters that I picked out of this town. We had no field to play on here. We played in Rockwell, and we played in China Grove down in Rowan County. I had a station wagon, and it was a country squire Ford station wagon. I loaded up the whole ball team, and we played twice a week down there. We went undefeated. This was in the early 70s, 71 I think it was. We went undefeated. Somebody says, why don't you get American Legion baseball started? So I went around to people, got a lot of people here to help me, and talked with people in town, and some said, don't do it, don't do it, it will cost you. You know, we lost money, American Legion baseball. The American Legion had just about gone out. We didn't have many American Legion people at a meeting, and nobody to really back it, but I asked several people if they would sign the papers that I would be responsible. I would raise the money and get people to help me, and we raised, I think it was $3,600. 1972, I believe, was the first year. Could have been 73. Don't hold me to it. But it's been 35 years. But at any rate, we raised the money from townspeople, donations, whatever. I remember Gene Johnson let me use his name up at Johnson's Hardware. You folks have heard of Johnson's Hardware. Gene let me use his name and says, Whitey, anything you want, it won't cost you 1 penny over the wholesale cost. We'll just let you pay the invoice. And Gene was so kind, and so many people were so gracious and donated that they believed that we could run an American Legion program. And so we did. And we started out in 1970 something, and we had a very successful baseball program for 35 years now. And 10 years ago, I was the first from Morville that entered the North Carolina Baseball Hall of Fame, and we've had 3 others since then. Frank Owens, Phil McLaughlin, Johnny Lewis, and this year we're going to have one of my assistant coaches, a guy by the name of Charlie Green. But now going back to, when I got out of American Legion baseball in 1953, I signed a professional contract. I was playing with Landis, working in the mill. They gave me a job, and during the summer, here come this guy by the name of Tex Miller with his big cigar in his mouth, and said, "Son," said, "we think you can play Major League Baseball, and we would like to sign you to Cincinnati Red. Would love to sign you to a professional contract." I was 17 years old, and he said, "We'll also give you $1,500. Well, gosh, coming from a family of 15, I had never seen that kind of money, folks. I'm telling you, come from a family of 15, you just don't see $1,500 back in the 50s. So that I realized my lifelong dream of being able to play professional baseball, and I played for about 6 different seasons. Never quite got to the big leagues, but at least I had a chance to pursue my dreams, and I had a wonderful time doing it. And my wife and I got married before the first year. I didn't want to leave town without her, and after 53 years, she's still by my side. Thank the good Lord for that. And we've raised our family on the outskirts near the farm. Joins the farm where I live. We've had a ball field there for 40-some years, and I've recently built another field down there that many kids have played baseball out there and enjoyed it. Also, going back to when I started playing American Legion baseball, one of the happiest moments of my life was back then. We had a field right in front of our house, and a fellow talked my dad into not raising cotton one year to put a ball field there where some of his boys could play baseball, and by golly, that was, I guess, one of the happiest days of my life when we didn't have that cotton field. We still had cotton, but not in that field. That was just one field off the farm. We didn't have to worry about picking cotton, and we were real happy that we could play baseball. I had a couple other brothers. Well, in fact, one day we played a baseball game on that field, and 9 brothers played, and my dad pinch hit that day. So it was a great time. So that takes me, that's about the baseball part of my life that I remember.
Could you tell us what position you played?
Well, 50 pounds ago, I was a shortstop. I pitched in high school, and I did play short, and later on, I went to third base after I'd gained a little weight and didn't have the mobility like I had early on when I weighed a lot less, but I could play shortstop. I pitched. I enjoyed pitching, and had a brother that was real good as a pitcher, brother named Frank, and a brother named James. James he pitched in college and gave it up after a while, and then Frank, he played professional baseball, and we played semi-pro, all of us, for many years out in what they call the Yadkin Valley League, and then later on it was a Stan Musial League. But my brother Frank, he still played softball till he was 60 years old. Frank is something like 69 now. I'm 71. He's 69 now, and he played, well, he was in his 60s when he quit. I'm not sure. He might have been 65 years old, but he was a heck of an athlete. But James was a good athlete, too. We did the most of the playing, the youngest 3. But I come from a family of 15, I say. Dad was married his first time. He had 7 boys and 1 girl. His wife died with cancer. Mom was married her first time. She had 1 boy and 2 girls. Her husband got killed in a wreck. And Mom and Dad married. And then I was the first out of 5 more. We had 1 little brother to die at sudden infant syndrome. But Mom went from 3 kids to 11. 11 overnight, and that was really something. But it wasn't like 15 of us from the same spouses or whatever. But we still were one big happy family. We were never at home. Some were married and gone before others came along, and we were never there together. But we've had so many wonderful, wonderful occasions, family get-togethers, picnics at the lake, in our basement for years. We met in our basement, invited whole family, and it's been a great run, for me.
So when you were brought up as a child, each one of you had your own room, is that right?
No, sir. No, we didn't have our own room. That would have been great. We slept together, and we had an upstairs, and we could hear the rain beating down on the roof at night. And with 15 in the family, and we moved here in the 40s, and we didn't even have electric lights. We had lamps. We did not have a refrigerator. We kept our milk in a spring. We would milk the cows before we went to school and at night, and we kept our milk in the spring. We cooked with stove wood, and firewood was to heat with. Now, old people will tell you, if you hear somebody talk about we cooked the kitchen, we did stove wood for the kitchen, they don't know what they're talking about. Firewood for the kitchen, that firewood was used to heat the house, and stove wood was used, it was a dry wood. We could use green wood to heat the house, which was firewood, but stove wood was always dry, and it was always what Mom fixed biscuits with. And we had biscuits 3 times a day, and sometimes we'd have cornbread. We had a lot of cornbread milk for supper. We'd go to spring and get our milk and put it in gallon jugs, and we'd bring it to the house, and that's what we had for our supper. Cornbread and milk, and sometimes we would have gravy and biscuits for supper. And back in those days, everybody was poor, but we always seemed to see people that were poorer than we were. But it was a wonderful time, and the happiest time that we had was when we had an outside well and didn't have to go to that spring to get water anymore. We had our well on the outside of the house, and that you could come in from the field. I would work the mules, plow the cotton, and get the hay, plow the corn, whatever, and come in and stick my head under that cool water, just turn it on. And we had gotten electricity a little bit before that time. That was a plus. But to me, when we got water running on the outside of the house, that was the biggest plus I ever had in my life.
When you went to town, you said you went to the ball games and so forth. What other types of entertainment, if anything, did you go to shows or anything?
Well, back in those days, we had 3 movies, and we had 2 movies. One was the Carolina Theater, and one was the State Theater. And as a youngster, we would go in the daytime and see these continued pictures, a guy by the name of Spy Masher and Superman or Tarzan. These were some of the little old things that would be continued, and we would always want to get back. But Mom and Dad would see to it that we could get there on Saturdays, and we have walked home when we had no other way, 5-6 miles out from the movie into the country. But the baseball games, and another aspect of the baseball games that I really enjoyed when we come to town, the baseball games, sometimes we would go down and watch the games through the knot holes or get in the crow's nest behind the ballpark or whatever. But then after the ball game, we would wait till 11 o'clock. The ball game might be over at 10, but we would wait in our brother's car. Some of them worked at the mill, and we would wait till they got off work at 11 to go home. And as they would go home, we would wait another 15 minutes for my dad to come from Kannapolis on the bus at the head of our road out on North Main, on Wiggins Road. It's North Main, but it was Wiggins Road out in the country back in those days. But en route to that, I would stop at O.C. Stone Street. You folks have heard people talk about Stone Street's cafe. O.C. Stone Street. I would stop there. And early on, when I was a little boy, I would tell him, the girls, the waitress would, can I help you, can I help you? And I said, no, I don't think so. I said, I want to see O.C. I want to talk to him about the ball game. And O.C. would come up there and I would start telling him about the ball game. And I learned early on that to take it out as long as I could, because I'd say, well, first of all, could I have a small cone of ice cream? And I would have a nickel. And he would start dipping. And as I would start telling him, I would start from the first inning. I wouldn't say the score was 6-5 or such and such. I would start at the first inning, and he'd dip a while, and he'd take his cigar out, and he would listen. He'd look at it, and he'd stick his cigar, he'd start dipping. So, folks, I learned early on to go all the way through that ball game, and I'd have one of the biggest cones of ice cream you ever seen.
At the community house, you played ball there. There were other activities there. They had church gatherings and stuff. I mean, not church, but Christmas gatherings and celebrations and stuff. Were you able to participate in any of that?
I did not, because that was mostly for the people that lived here in town. That my activities were at the ball field, and I even think they had dancing and things like that at the community house. But I wasn't involved with that at all. I just played baseball and see some of the guys pitching horseshoe and see some of the things that went on. And that community house was a big thing back then. You know, it was like a citizen center or whatever we have here. But the other thing that I got to participate in is I remember they used to have a barbecue every 4th of July or every Labor Day. I'm not sure. Maybe both. And the meal would give people tickets, you know, their families. And I can remember going to that barbecue with people back in the 40s. And they would have the big old tin tubs of knee-highs and well, the knee-highs came out in the 40s, I believe, but knee-high grape, knee-high orange, big old Pepsis, Coca-Colas, RCs, and of course, I never would get a 6 or 8 ounce drink if I could get a 12. I don't care what it was. But that was the first recollection of barbecue that I can ever remember eating. And it was mighty, mighty good.
And you said you lived out on the Catawba River for a while.
Yes, sir.
What did you do while you were there? You were still young then when you lived there.
Well, I was born on the banks of the Catawba River, right at the end of the hot hole. And Mom and Dad, after they got married, I was the first little baby in the community there, seems like. And it was a Talbert family that befriended me. Our neighbors were over there. And I can remember going to their house. And these people, these girls, it was a large family. It was 3 boys in the family, and I think 6 girls or so. And they would always have chocolate cake and go to the spring and get some milk. And I would have chocolate cake and milk. And they did it, I can remember it. I couldn't have been but 3 or 4 years old when this was going on. The most at 5. And I can remember that like it was yesterday. I remember the flood of 40. All the watermelons got gone, and we went down. Our watermelon patch was covered with water. We had bottomlands over there. And we went down to the river, to the bridge. The water on the Arthur County side was underwater. Now, over on the Catawba side, that bridge was a little bit higher. But over on the Arthur County side was underwater. And the bridge wasn't a straight bridge. It was sort of crooked around. And this is the bridge we have out there now is the 3rd bridge that I remember crossing the Catawba River on. But I remember people having nets catching watermelons, and they were lined up on this side. They would pull those watermelons out there, and I thought, Lord, they're going to get all of our watermelons. And I was just a little boy. But they were catching people's watermelons all up and down that river. And putting them up there. And once in a while, you might see a cow, a hog, come kicking down trying to get out of the flood. And it was a bad time. But my dad, that was what Dad Jim, his favorite word was Dad Jim. and he would say, "Dad, Jim, I'm going to get off this river, Mom, before one of our kids get drowned." You know, as many of he never missed us, you know, as many of us as it was.
What do you mean by the hot hole?
The hot hole is what we call a hot hole now. When water comes out of that steam plant over there at Marshall, it comes down. They have dug a channel, a canal down through there, and used to be the old river loop. Well, on that side of the river, we call it the river bend. On this side, they call it the river loop. And that hot hole runs right into where that river bended, the old Catawba River bended. And it was a canal dug, and they dumped the water that they make the steam out of at the steam plant out in there. And that's the reason it's called the hot hole. And it's good for fishing any time of the year. Mostly people go early in the spring to catch fish over there because that water is much warmer and the fish bite a little bit better.
We understand that you also did a little bit as a barber. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this barbering goes back to I was in spring training with the Detroit Tigers, had bought me from Cincinnati, 1956, and I was invited to spring training with the Detroit Tiger farm team, and I saw these clippers in a Walgreens drugstore down there. And Mom had always cut our clippers. I cut our hair with hand clippers. And Lord, as many kids they were, sometimes you'd be getting real tired, you know, and you had to really be still. But I saw these clippers. They were $9.95, and I bought them and put them in my locker. I tried to, over the years coming up, in the mid-40s, I tried to cut some nephew's hair. Mom had some old plug clippers, and I tried to cut hair. My brother got out of service, and he came home with electric clippers. He had learned to cut hair in the Army, and Brother Bill would plug it in on the front porch. Had a brother that was an electrician. Brother Gene would wire it where he could plug them in, and he'd cut our hair. I don't care how cold it was. It would just tickle us to death to have our hair cut by clippers. It was like a store-bought haircut. And that's what got me intrigued with barbering. So when I went to spring training, I wanted to cut my son's hair. Donnie was a baby, 1956, just a small child. I said, shoot, it's not any future than that. So I went and got me some clippers at a Walgreens drugstore, put them in my barracks there in Tiger Town where we were in spring training. Old boy from Texas says, "Whitey, what are you doing with those clippers?" I said, "Well, wherever the Tigers send me this summer, I'm gonna cut my son's hair." He said, "Well, how about cutting mine?" I said, "I don't care how I look." I said, "Well, I don't either." So I cut his hair, and it didn't look bad. And the next guy's haircut was from Texas. It didn't look bad. And before you know it, guys in spring training, "How about give me a trim? How about give me a trim?" And I was cutting hair when I wasn't playing ball there, and by golly, that was in the spring of '57. I said '56. That was in the spring of '57. Detroit Tigers sent me to Valdosta, Georgia, and Georgia-Florida League that summer. I cut all the ball players' hair. It looked real good. And by the end of the year, I come back to Morton. We would always come back home, and I went to Winston-Salem to see what it would take what I could do to enroll in barber school. And I went over there and enrolled in barber school, and I had to go 9 months to barber school. I couldn't go to spring training. Detroit Tigers gave me my release, but I went ahead and got my barber license. I had spent 4 years in the minor leagues, wasn't in the big leagues yet, and I went to Winston-Salem, got my barber license, and in 1958 I was playing baseball here in town, wasn't playing professional, and I was cutting hair. Then in the spring of '59, I was 23 years old, and a guy came and says, a guy from the Charlotte Hornets baseball team said, "Whitey," says a guy, New York Yankees scout, said that you could play for the Charlotte Hornets, and we would like for you to go to spring training. Well, I wasn't but 23. Baseball was my first love. I had the rest of my life to cut hair, so I hung up my clippers and went back back in '59 and played part of the summer, and signed with the White Sox. Didn't sign with the Charlotte, Minnesota Twins. They wanted to sign me. Jack McKeon had just won the World Series a couple of years ago. He wanted me to go to Fox Cities, Iowa, and I didn't want to go that far away again from home. And we had our children at that time. I'm thinking I'm not sure where Cindy was born. I'll have to check that out. But I went back and played the summer of '59 and played half the summer, then came home. In 1960, I was still cutting hair, and Salisbury had a team in this Western Carolina League that Crawdads and Hickory Crawdads and Kannapolis Intimidators are in now. We started it in '60, and I went and played part of the summer there, and that was my last year. I played part of the summer, and I quit and started cutting hair. In fact, I couldn't be at all the ball games, and they needed somebody they could depend on to, and I couldn't leave the barbershop. That was my livelihood now, and I quit playing baseball in the middle of the summer. Then they wanted me to come back in the fall in the playoffs. They had a player that left town. He had to go back. Our coach was coaching college, a guy by the name of Larry Taylor. And they asked me if I would come back and play. And I went back in 1960, and I played my final professional baseball game at Newman Park. And I remember driving in. We won 4-2, and I remember driving in 2 of the runs in the last game I ever played. I was very happy about that. But then I stuck to barbering after 1960, and I quit 3 years ago when I had grandsons come, but had one boy that's been with me the whole time.
Where's your shop located?
It's at Harris Teeter Shopping Center. We moved up there 40 years ago. 1966 we moved into that shopping center, and you know the longevity of shopping centers are 20 years at the most now, seems like, that successful years you might say. And of course Harris Teeter Grocery has been gone a good many years from up there, but the barber shop and the beauty shop are still the two that we opened up when that shop, Joanne's Beauty Shop and Whitey's Barber Shop, are still there and back on the same corners that they were. And we are the only 2 charter members, you might say, of that shopping center. And they're still going.
What address? What's the street?
132 East Statesville Avenue.
On Statesville Avenue. Okay.
132 East Statesville Avenue is and that's what we're facing, East Statesville Avenue. And it's, of course, the front of the shopping center is on Main Street, but no one is in the big grocery store, and that hurts. But I still have 2 grandsons that's cutting hair there, and a good friend that's been there for 40 years, Everett Baxter. But I don't barber anymore.
There are a lot of stories that are thrown around in barbershops. People come in and gab just starts to go. Is there any one story or a couple of stories that you remember that bring back fond memories?
Well, one of the best stories I like to tell. One of the best stories I like to tell, and the guy that's been with me for 40 years, Everett Baxter, he would always go to summer school. I've told this story on him so many times. He would always have to go to summer school. Several years later, a guy by the name of Bobby Jean Honeycutt came to the barber shop, and he made her 5th barber. Had Jimmy Moore, Bobby Ligon, Everett Baxter, and Bobby Honeycutt made her 5th barber. Well, every year, Bobby Jean would have to go to summer school while he was coming up, before he ever got to be a barber. Well, by golly, when he went to get his master barber, when he went to get his apprentice barber license, he failed his written test. Just typical of having to go to summer school. He could cut hair. Real good barber, he could cut hair. And then, after failing his written test, I nicknamed him Goofy. I named Everett Goofy because he had to go, and his cousin Bobby Jean was Dumbo. And that really didn't stick with them. But the story I'm going to tell you is a true story. And sure enough, a few months later, Bobby had to go back to take his written test over, and he says, I'm going to call you collect from Charlotte when I get my barber license, and I'm going to call you collect. And I says, okay, you call. So sure enough, he went back, and he passed his written test that day, and he called collect. The operator says, we have a collect call from Dumbo to Goofy. I says, Everett, telephone. Everett picks up the telephone, says, we have a collect call from Dumbo to Goofy. Are you Goofy? Everett said, yes, ma'am. That's one of the best stories. It's so many in the barbershop, and the guy that I worked with was a shine boy that raised his family. We call him the shine boy. That was Lee Pinkston. Lee raised 6 children, and his grandchildren too. But he raised them shining shoes at Howard and Baxter Barbershop. Then Whitey's Barbershop, he went with us later on, years later. And he literally raised his family, but it was so many stories. Early on, I remember the first week I worked in that barbershop, that was Howard and Baxter. I'd just come home from playing baseball, and he would always go to the bank for us. Piedmont Bank is right down on the corner there on Main Street, old Piedmont Bank. He would go down there and get change for us. And one day he went down there, and the lady gave him the change, and he looked, and she had laid down 3 ones for mine. He says, I beg your pardon, ma'am, I believe you made a mistake. He said, Whitey wanted 5 ones. He said, well, you tell Whitey to send a $5 check instead of a 3. I knew it was a 3, and he came back to the barbershop. Now listen, you're going to start this. I'm not going to get you any change anymore. Said, why didn't you tell me that was a $3 check? I said, Lee, you asked me what I wanted, not what I had. So we all the time, it's so many stories that I don't remember now that happened at the barbershop, but it was great. Just like baseball, there's so many stories out there in baseball. One of the greatest stories in baseball that I had was years ago when I was playing in Valdosta, Georgia. We had played against Earl Weaver, who later on managed the Baltimore Orioles, and we had a guy on the team by the name of Dick Walter. He had met his wife to be in spring training. Gave her a diamond in spring training. We were only in spring training a month. This was the same year that I learned to cut hair. 1957, this went well. He met this girl, and they were going to get married in Fitzgerald. He was going to pitch that night. So Dick Walter pitched that night in Fitzgerald. He won his ball game, and our coach gave him a couple days off for his honeymoon because he wouldn't be able to pitch again for 3 or 4 days. He left Fitzgerald, going back to Valdosta, and they had a kid by the name of Dick Cicero with them from California. And he was his best man in the wedding. So he was coming back, he and Nancy was his wife name, were coming back to Valdosta, and they come across a flash flood. We see tornadoes and all going on down there. Well, back in those days, we had more flash floods in South Georgia than we had tornadoes. And it was a flash flood, and he saw this car off to the right of the road, and he jumped out, and he heard people screaming on his left side, going down through the swamp. The flood was washing them, and they was grabbing tree branches, trying to hold on, and they were screaming. He jerks all his clothes off, down to his shorts. He dives in that water. Now, they had gone off the right of the road, and the water had swirled them in under the road in a culvert. And they didn't drown. A man, his wife, and a daughter. He swims out there, and he saves all 3. He gets all 3 of these people, swims back to the bank somehow. I don't know how he done. Got them back to the bank, and this people by that time had stopped and had blankets or whatever, and trying to cover him up and dry the people off, whatever. And that was one of the bravest, one of the. You know, if you ever go to battle, he was the one. And later on in the summer, this same guy that saved these people, and his name was written up all over the country about his heroic deeds. But this guy was, and I think all three of these people had polio in the 40s. I'm not sure, but I think all three of them had polio, and they were crippled. They really couldn't swim. And it was back, you remember when the polio situation came in the 40s. And then back later on in the summer, he was pitching. And he threw one day, and the guy hit a line drive and broke his right arm. And instead of rolling around in pain, he threw his glove off. His arm was crooked. He threw his glove off. He picked the ball up and tried to throw the guy out left-handed, which he was a right-hander, but he almost got him, missed him by half a stick left-handed. I always told people if I ever went to battle, I wanted to go with Dick Walter, because Dick Walter was certainly a brave man.
You said that you worked at the mill part-time?
Yes. Every year I would come home. In fact, the last year I played American Legion baseball, I was 16 years old, and I worked first shift in the spinning mill, and I would play ball at night. And then later on, I did a pretty good job evidently, but every year I would come home from playing baseball, and all I had to do was go down to the mill, and by hopefully being a good worker was what they would always give me a job, and I would work in the mill in the wintertime. And that's the same as what happened with guys that played on the Moore's baseball team. A lot of them were offered jobs in the mill in the wintertime to get them to play.
Which mill did you work at?
I worked at Moore's Mill. And we also had, in those days, we had a team at Cascade that played in a Tri-County League. They played semi-pro baseball. They played 2 games a week. And of course, a lot of towns, like when we built our ball field out there in front of our house, it was called Sunny Hill. We played Red Hill, Mazeppa. Every crossroads had a little baseball team back in those days. And everybody played baseball on Saturday afternoon or went to a baseball game, seems like. That was what it was mostly. Except a lot of times, baseball season wasn't going on. We'd come to town and everybody would shop. Everybody would come to town on Saturday.
You shared a story with us earlier about meeting your wife a couple of times.
Well, and I told this story too, and it's a good story. But I met her. I say first of all, we met when we were 5 years old, before we went to school over at Cheryl Ford School. The year when kids were 5, they would go to school, that were going into school the next year. Older siblings would take them to school. Older sisters, older brothers would take them and let them visit school, see what they were going to get a taste of. And I always kid my wife about, honey, I had to meet you when I was 5 years old. We had to rub elbows. We had to have something going on then. And then I tell her I didn't see her again till I was playing American Legion baseball. And my brother says, Whitey hit a home run for me, and I looked back there, and I like to tell a story about this pretty little redhead, auburn color hair, had the most beautiful smile I ever seen. And I said, gosh, I got up and I hit a triple. Somebody else knocked me in. I come in to score, and little brother James says, that's the way to go, Whitey. And I looked up at him, and I really wasn't looking at him. I was looking for that beautiful smile, and sure enough, there it still was. And I said, gosh, I got to get to know her. And I tell this story too. When I was inducted into the North Carolina Hall of Fame, I asked my wife to take the time to stand on the podium with me when I accepted my award for being in the Hall of Fame, because she had been with me throughout my career. And I said, she came up there, and her hair is white now. It's beautiful white. And I tell people, I said, now folks, when I said, I've got to meet that little girl at American Legion baseball game. I said, now folks, that's been 40-some years ago. And I said, now, but I said, when she gave me that big smile. First of all, when she gave me that big smile, I said, it really turned me on. I might have already said that. It really turned me on to hit a triple. But I said, now, that's been 40-some years ago. I said, now, her hair has changed colors a little bit. But I said, she still has that same beautiful smile. And it still turns me on. that brought down the house. That brought down the house. I had 5 of my grandsons there. My preacher was there. We had a good group there. But it brought down the house.
When you played ball and you had to go to Detroit and Cincinnati and all, did your family go with you during
I never went to those places. It was just minor leagues only. I never went to Cincinnati. I never went. But my wife went with me when I went to, in fact, they sent me to Idaho. The first year I was in the Tiger organizations, and I was telling about my wife being, when I was introduced in the Hall of Fame, I was telling about her. I had to have her on the podium because she went with me throughout my career. She was with me in the Grand Teton Mountains when it was just a one-way passage, and we were in our 49 Ford, and Donnie was a baby, and she was putting on brakes. I said, we went through the dust storms that same summer when Detroit sent me from Idaho back to Panama City, Florida. She was sitting right there putting on brakes in those dust storms, and I said I just couldn't do it without her. And she went with me when I traveled, and that worked better for us.
Well, Mr. Meadows, we certainly do appreciate you taking your time today to talk with us and giving us these wonderful stories and telling us about some of your life. Is there anything else you'd like to add to wrap this up, or?
Well, something will come after I leave. It always does. I know you folks told us to write some of these things down, and there's still a lot of wonderful stories out there.
Well, if you have something that comes up that you want to add, we can certainly come back and add it to the tape. That won't be a problem. We've certainly enjoyed this, and again, we thank you so much for your time.
Well, you're certainly welcome, and I have enjoyed it too.